I'm speaking today to you from the lands of the Pawtucket and the Massachusetts. And just wanted to say that I listened to Max's talk yesterday and really appreciated Max's talking about land acknowledgements and some of the debates around them, and also, the acknowledgement of always speaking from fraught terrain. And this is, in a sense, also what my talk is going to be about today. And I just wanted to say before I start the presentation, I'm going to turn off, while I present, I'm going to share my screen, but I'm going to turn off my camera because I have an eye issue, and if I just spend too much time on the screen, it gets triggered. So I'm gonna turn my camera off now, but I'll be back for the discussion. All right. Okay, so I'm sharing my screen. Let's see whether this works. All right, everybody can see.
It looks great. Yes, okay. Thank you.
Okay, great. So the title of my talk is called Rural City, Urban Worlds at the Edges of Habitability. There's a small plot of land at the edge of Kreuzberg that has a peculiar story. This is how the story goes. In 1983, Osman Kalin had just quit his job. Being a construction worker for many years, he struggled with back problems and was forced to retire early. Yet soon he got bored and was ready for a construction project of a different sort. Living in West Berlin, a few blocks from the Berlin Wall, one day he discovered a small triangle of land littered with garbage in the wall's shadow. Osman cleared it and began to grow onions, tomatoes, and cabbage on it. As time went on, he added cucumbers, garlic, beans, sunflowers, collard greens, and sold them at the local vegetable market. With his wife, he built a hut that soon developed into a two-floor shack cobbled together from found objects. Months later, just when the tomatoes began to ripen, 2 East German border guards knocked at Osman's door. His garden, it turned out, was located on GDR territory across the other side of the border, and thus in socialist East Berlin, or what was then socialist East Berlin. The East German government had constructed the wall in a straight line to save money instead of following the zigzag contours of the actual border, thus skipping the triangle of land on which Osman's vegetables were now thriving. After endless negotiations, the guards allowed Osman to stay, provided his sunflowers did not grow taller than the Berlin Wall. In 1989, the wall fell and Osman's garden was no longer situated in an abandoned corner, but right in the center of a unified Berlin. When the new district office protested the garden dwelling, he insisted the East German state had entrusted the piece of land to him. In the end, the dismal state of Berlin's finances assisted Osman's cause. The city ran out of money, and plans to re-landscape the former border zone into a green strip did not materialize for a long time. Hence, Osman's garden was once again left alone. Today, people affectionately call the garden the Berlin Gecekondu, in honor of the Turkish Gecekondu, literally called places built overnight. Simple apartment buildings with courtyards and trees that resemble the structure of Anatolian villages. The Gecekondu emerged at the height of rural urban migration at the edges of Turkish cities in the 1950s and 60s. Many Turkish Berliners, like Osman, lived in them with their families before they came to Berlin. Not unlike the Turkish Gecekondu, the Berlin version now features a small orchard of apricot, apple, pear, and plum trees. A large tree of heaven, once a small shrub growing out of the cracks of the sidewalk, is also an integral part of the Gecekondu's front wall. Each year, as the trunk expands, Osman cuts further into the wall to accommodate its growth. The Berlin Gecekondu is well known among Berliners and as far as Istanbul, where news reporters have chuckled about Osman's clever dealings. Sometimes on the weekend, a tourist group stops by. In front of the garden shack, Osman put a few chairs and a table. You can see them on the left here. Once the table was stolen, the next day, Osman quickly replaced it. Its legs are now cemented to the ground. I begin this talk with the story about the Berlin Gecekondu in order to introduce the notion of rural city. Nestled in a small gap in the city's border infrastructure, Osman Kalin's Gecekondu took advantage of the state's desire to simplify and draw straight lines. Thus, the garden's ecology filled the gap, both in Osman's life and in the gray zones of the nation state. Cobbled together from dreams, thriving vegetables, weeds, and thrown away furniture, the Gecekondu captures what I call rural worlds in the city. Now, as Kathy already mentioned earlier, the term ruderal comes from rudus, which is the Latin word for rubble. A common term in urban ecology, it refers to communities of organisms that emerge spontaneously in so-called disturbed environments, usually considered hostile to life. The cracks of sidewalks, the spaces alongside train tracks and roads, industrial sites, waste disposal areas, or rubble fields. Neither wild nor domesticated rural communities depend on an edge effect and the juxtaposition of contrasting environments in one ecosystem. Rural worlds initially entered my fieldwork via one particular person, Herbert Zukop, a well-known Berlin urban ecologist at the Technical University Berlin, who together with other botanists studied plants growing in Berlin's rubble after World War II. I met Zukop at the official opening event for Berlin's first so-called Urban Nature Day, organized by the Berlin Senate, when I originally embarked on my fieldwork in Berlin in the late 2000s. Through him, I learned about ruderal plants, such as sticky goosefoot, Chenopodium botrytis, and tree of heaven, Ailanthus altissima, plants that still thrive in Berlin today, including Osman's garden. Engaging with Zukop, as well as other Berliners like Osman, I learned a new way of seeing, sensing, and approaching the city. Drawing on my ongoing fieldwork in Berlin, I offer the notion rural city as an analytic framework for attending to human-environment relations that emerge in inhospitable environments. Using the rural as lens requires a mode of attention that changes the way we approach nature in the city. And I say nature here with quotation marks. Too often, Euro-Western imaginations frame cities as places of culture where human relations to plants and animals are carefully managed. In landscape parks, zoos, fenced-in gardens, or freely stocked zones. Indeed, nature has for a long time functions as the constitutive other of much urban analysis. With the development of industrial society, the city, specifically the European metropole, became the locus of culture, independent from the resources and labor of the countryside, as well as the colony. Although recent scholarship has challenged this divide by examining various ecologies of urbanism, urban analysis often continues to treat nature as background of urban life, or as Donna Haraway puts it, a physical place where you can go, and thus risks seeing cities as being in control over or apart from all that which is cast as non-human. Departing from this view, I'm interested in relations between people, plants, and other beings that disrupt a social order in which only specific kinds of nature or wildness seem appealing. Attention to the rural instead directs our view towards the often unnoticed, cosmopolitan, and yet precarious ways of remaking the urban fabric, and thus to the social and material heterogeneity of urban life in the ruins of capitalism, nationalism, and racism. If we understand rubble and ruins with thinkers such as Anne Stoller, Gaston Gardillo, or Anna Tsing, in the broad sense as the very environments we inhabit, which become increasingly uninhabitable because they're built on capitalist extraction, colonial violence, displacements, and profound environmental change, then perhaps the ruderal can serve as a guide to explore them. Thinking with the ruderal, the goal is not to equate people with plants, but to rather ask how people, plants, animals, and other beings get entangled in projects of nation making and the logic of capital and modernist planning, but also how they traverse them. This conceptual and methodological framework is part of my forthcoming book, titled Ruderal City, in which I argue that not only has there been a fraught history of constructing the nation through nature in Germany, but in contemporary Berlin, human-environment relations, once again, are a key register through which citizenship is articulated. More specifically, I trace how racial and class inequalities are reconfigured in conflicts over the use, knowledge, and management of urban green spaces. I do so by engaging a series of practices, communities, and landscapes, ranging from Turkish migrants who cultivate gardens to wild barbecuing, and the so-called wild barbecuing, people call it in this way, and the use of parks as economic resource, to the experiences of refugees who live on former GDR military ruins in what they themselves call the German bush at Berlin's peripheries. These seemingly disparate sites provide snapshots of social exclusions that mark not only people's bodies, but also more than human worlds. They illustrate that nature not only becomes a material and symbolic unifying tool for past and present projects of nation-making, urban governments, and colonial violence, but also can open up other future possibilities. Promoting such a dual perspective, my goal in the book is to create a dialogue between often disparate conversations in anthropology, urban geography, environmental history, and science studies. In recent years, anthropologists and scholars across the human sciences have turned their attention towards an analysis of the built environment and infrastructure, highlighting how the physical networks of cities, such as roads, trains, electric grids, or water and waste and sewage systems, enable social life and forms of urban governance. Many ethnographies have opened up fresh perspectives on the relationship between materiality, consciousness, and culture. This analytic shift emerges at a moment when the earthly entanglements of anthropology's central subject, anthropos, the human, and the toxic effects of managing nature as resource have become increasingly visible. In an era that often gets labeled as the Anthropocene, an era in which humans fundamentally changed the course of the Earth's ecosystems, cultural analysts thus once again call for reimagining the ways in which the relations between people, land, plants, and animals don't neatly fit into Western binaries of nature and culture. This call for a renewal carries a sense of urgency in the face of the climate crisis, the global circulation of toxins and waste, and planetary environmental risk. Anthropology, it seems, has become a science of ruins, examining, in Anna Tsing's words, the dynamics of life on a damaged planet. Now, the ruderal perspective that I develop in the book draws on these conversations to further undo the nature-culture divide in urban scholarship. But I also hope it pushes these frameworks further by directing focus on the ways in which the destructive effects of capitalism, racism, and nation-making become embodied in people's relation to land, to plants, and animals, beyond the boundaries of the human skin. I'm especially inspired by feminist and decolonial approaches that attempt to work against a singular focus on climate change or environments that does not take a closer look at the material and social constitution of the inhospitable and often socially and materially toxic and deeply racialized environments that make up people's lives today. So for the purpose of this talk and in an effort to sketch out my approach, I will first attend to an instance in Berlin's history in which the urban fabric literally burst apart. It is in this moment that the city emerged as more than human habitat, abundant with unexpected neighbors and illegal squatters. This rupture gave rise to a view of the city in which nature is not simply out there to be managed, controlled, and incorporated into anthropogenic landscapes via human infrastructures, but an unwieldy and integral part of the city, a ruderal city in which humans and non-humans have coexisted, however violently, all along. Moving across spatial and temporal scales, from the scale of the catastrophic to the everyday, from media discourse and scientific observation to everyday practices of cultivation, and from the ruins of war to the gardens of the present, I will, in the second part of my talk, return to contemporary Berlin and show how a ruderal city perspective might contribute to rethinking nature, migration, and culture in the study of urban landscapes, but also on a more general level to a cultural analysis of what it means to live on an increasingly inhospitable and uninhabitable planet. Okay. The frenzy of military technology of World War II brought a nightmare of destruction upon many cities across the globe. In an effort to exterminate its enemies from cities, the German fascist regime segregated and killed in ghettos and created cities of death. Toward the end of the war, applying a technology of urban destruction that Germans had utilized earlier, the Western Allies bombed large parts of Berlin to bring the Nazi regime to a final halt. Almost 50% of the city center's built environment was destroyed. The city's infrastructures tore apart. Trees and parks and urban woodlands burned down. People lived in makeshift shelters in the rubble. Amid the destruction, images of Berlin as feral city abounded. News of starving deer, wolves, and wild boar ravaging the city's outskirts and herds evoked a sense of Berlin gone wild. And with it, a widespread sentiment unfolded, numbness. In his book, A Natural History of Destruction, W.G. Sebald depicts this numbness as a key element of the social and ecological life of the bombed cities after fascism. Describing scenes of apathy amid a population living in ruins, Sebald shows how this anesthesia created a sanitized knowledge of human suffering, prevalent in much public discourse about the urban experience after the war. Amid the apathy, there is a lingering sense of uncanniness, which he traces, for example, in the second flowering of the lilacs after the firestorms, and in memories of playing in the overgrown ruins of war as a child. One never felt at ease, he writes, fearing one might bump into the body of an animal or a human corpse. Indeed, the botany of the rubble becomes an indicator of this violent history. You could guess the date of a building's destruction from the plants growing in the ruins. In this context of urban breakdown, described by Sebald and others, cultivating plants and rehabilitating nature played an important role in efforts to reconstruct the city. With food being scarce, many Berliners grew vegetables such as potatoes in the burned and locked down parks. Many local residents became savvy plant experts, participating in community events like Aktion Wildgemüse, Action Wild Vegetables, sorting out edible plants like dandelions and chickweed growing in the rubble. In the late 1940s, West Berlin's mayor declared the bombings of the city's major park, the Tiergarten, one of the largest scars inflicted on the city's body, and made its reforestation a top priority. thousands of oak and birch trees, were donated via plane during the Berlin airlift. At the same time, the city's rubble became an eyesore, a reminder of the moral and material ruin that the country found itself in. Its removal and naturalization became the precondition for national and economic recovery. When Berlin split into East and West, both municipalities hired thousands of workers and unemployed volunteers, many of them women, to clear the streets from rubble. As part of the so-called Aufbauprogramm, even the Berlin Bear lured East Berliners into the world of reconstructing the city via this poster published in 1952. The removal of the rubble enabled a careful management of what would become urban nature. Not only did rubble become an invisible part of the city's infrastructure, as it was recycled to rebuild roads and buildings, but it was also integrated into the city's natural landscape. It was piled up and landscaped into so-called Rubble Mountains, covered with trees and shrubs. Today's Berlin's Rubble Mountains, 14 of them all together, appear as a natural part of its landscape. The highest among them is 114 meters tall and contains 12 million cubic meters of rubble. Perhaps appropriately so, its name is Teufelsberg, Devil's Mountain. Although coded into a different language of socialist and capitalist futures, greening the rubble became a major element in the cultural imaginary after the war in both East and West Germany. The notion of new life emerging out of ruins was now an object of nostalgia and an imagined future. The verse, Aus Ruinen auferstanden, rising from ruins, became the title of the East German national anthem in 1949. And the so-called rubble women entered the national imagination as heroic figures. In the 1950s, West Germany depicted the this image on its 50-pfennig coin, a woman planting an oak seedling, thus commemorating the rubble women, as well as women reforesting the locked and burned down forests after the war. Yet despite this careful management of nature, the rubble had its own life. Due to Berlin's division during the Cold War, rubble fields stubbornly dotted the city for decades. Curiously, the blasted landscapes of the war provided a habitat for plants to flourish in the city for the first time. Intrigued by this new diversity, West Berlin botanists, both hobbyists and trained ecologists, soon began to study the rubble vegetation and developed a different way of noticing nature in the city. One of the botanists was Herbert Suchop, then a graduate student at the Free University of Berlin. Suchop was born in Berlin in 1930 and grew up in a landscape blasted by the bombings. As we sat sipping tea in his office at the Institute for Ecology at the Technische Universität Berlin, Suchop told me that the rubble fields scattered throughout the midst of the city were an integral part of his childhood and also his adolescence, and could hardly be overlooked. In fact, when I asked him how he began studying the rubble's ecology, he said, "How could I have studied anything else than rubble spaces?" Indeed, the increasing division of the city created a new situation for West Berlin botanists. Instead of traveling to their usual field sites in the countryside or as far as Brazil, they were now in fact literally walled off from their surroundings. Thus, in a city busy with national reconstruction, the botanists re-envisioned the city and its rubble as that which was new and unknown. Researching the rubble flora, they discovered a city bustling with plants from all over the world. These plants, usually considered non-native species or weeds, were from warmer regions in the Mediterranean, Asia, and the Americas. Among them, sticky goosefoot, Chenopodium botrytis, a Mediterranean plant usually growing south of the Alps, as well as a tree from China, Ailanthus altissima, or tree of heaven, now growing in Osborne's garden or on Berlin's sidewalks. The North American tree Robinia pseudoacacia, black locust, and the herb Solidago giganteana, giant goldenrod, which all appeared widely in Berlin for the first time. These plants were ruderal plants. They preferred dry and gravelly soils and a warm climate. Their seeds had found their way into the city via diverse transport routes. Some of them had crossed the city on the boots of soldiers or refugees during the war. Others via packaging material from imported goods or via hay transported on wagons by the Russian army. Other seeds routes remained unknown. Struck by this diversity of plants, the botanists studied their ecology in detail from the mid-1950s on, examining the plant's dispersal, tissue production, the effects of light on their growth, their water regimes, habitats, and associations, and the successional dynamic of the ruderal vegetation they were part of. As the botanists followed the ruderal plants, a world of cosmopolitan connection and profound environmental change unfolded in front of their eyes. For example, the highest density of sticky goosefoot, it turned out, occurred in the bombed city center. Increasing trade, migration, and urbanization had created a diversification of habitats, and a new type of vegetation became visible. An urban vegetation spontaneously growing in so-called disturbed places and alongside the city's built infrastructure. The first to inhabit disturbed lands, ruderals were not necessarily a nuisance. They set the stage for other flourishing ecosystems, for example, by giving rise to spontaneous wetlands or attracting birds, or providing shade and organic matter important for other species. And yet they were not simply a sign of regenerating nature, but the outcome of a much more ambivalent, sticky, and radically changing urban ecology. The growth of ruderal plants had been promoted by a slow climate warming in cities and on Earth over the course of the past 2 centuries. Tracking the life cycles of plants like tree of heaven or sticky goosefoot, their different phases of budding, leafing, flowering, and fruiting, one could determine that Berlin, like other cities, had become hotter. Due to the city's infrastructure, its increasing traffic and densely built environments, as well as artificial heat sources in the city and rising temperatures on Earth, ruderals were thus indicators of global connections, a city coming back to life, and global environmental change. And they were the traces of the violence nationalism and racism had wrought across Europe. The encounter between botanists and ruderal plants led to the emergence of urban ecology as a new field of scientific inquiry in Berlin. And it opened up new possibilities for including urban wastelands into city planning, and in so-called urban wastelands into city planning in enduring ways, as Jens Lachmund has argued in his book, Greening Berlin. Yet Lachmund also shows, and this is important, that this view on the heterogeneity of urban nature was integrated into new forms of urban governments and lost much of its initial political momentum, because urban landscape policies created new hierarchies of value according to different habitats' degree of closeness to nature. Despite this incorporation of ecological research into urban governance, I argue that the encounter between botanists and ruderal plants created an opening for approaching the city in a different way and for cultural analysis more generally. To explore these possibilities, it is necessary to move beyond science and botany, so deeply entangled with colonial history, and consider everyday ways of relating to more than human worlds in the city. Neither wild nor domesticated ruderal ecologies emerge alongside urban infrastructure and in their cracks. The presence of trees of heaven and their rural companions thus created an opening for a different way of knowing the urban landscape that exceeds systems of urban governance. This way of approaching the city diverges from previous imaginaries of the city as space of culture or cultivated nature, as well as a view of the nation as homogeneous entity. Although the botanists made use of categories such as foreigners, invaders, or guests, and thus engaged geographic imaginations connecting plants to a world of nations, borders, and immigration, they saw ruderal plants as integral part of the urban landscape. This not only stood in stark contrast to post-war urban planning, but also to the native natures the fascist regime had dreamt of. In addition, in a critique of modernity's abstraction, Nazi thought had been fascinated with wilderness, defined as untouched nature. Yet only certain kinds of wild things that were in line with their racial ideology and assumed ecologies were allowed. Undesired aliens had to be weeded out. The city, on the other hand, was imagined as anti-nature, full of social ills, and as a space of dangerous racial mixing. As the botanists engaged with ruderal plants, the city ceased to appear as only human habitat, separate from or in full control over nature. Deeply ambiguous figures, these plants remind us of the unplanned lives in the ruins of landscapes of war, nationalism, and environmental degradation. Let me elaborate then on how, in my own research in Berlin, the ruderal has served as a guide. The period after the collapse of socialism and German so-called reunification has constituted yet another fraught moment in German history when the nation had to reinvent itself. Not unlike after the war, urban plant publics and green space have again taken up a central role in both materially and symbolically naturalizing social bonds and solidifying the nation's cohesion. This process has been tangible in Berlin's urban fabric. Since the fall of the Berlin Wall, new regimes of urban and environmental policymaking have transformed Berlin's material environment, reconstituting it as a national capital and European metropole. For example, the city's landscape program established a ring and network of parks and green corridors as part of a reconstruction plan for a unified Berlin. In addition, the city's 19th century legacies of environmental conservation, the experience of urban breakdown in 1945, and the subsequent political division and deindustrialization during the Cold War created an abundance of open spaces such as parks, city forests, gardens, and abandoned lands in Berlin and its surroundings. Thus today, even though many spaces have and continue to be lost to urban development, Berlin is often promoted as one of the greenest European metropoles. Experts report a striking diversity of the city's fauna and flora, despite the endangerment of many plant and animal species by urbanization. TV shows and news reports titled Wilderness in Berlin portray an abundance of wild animals, especially wild boar, estimated to be around 4,000 to 6,000 within the city limits. As a result of climate change, urban sprawl, increasing traffic, deforestation, over-fertilization, and consolidation of farmland, many animals as well as plants indeed migrate from rural areas and make the city their permanent habitat. Intrigued by this diversity, a variety of publics tending to urban nature have sprung up across the city. During Berlin's annual so-called Urban Nature Day, thousands of residents tour the city to discover nature's magic. They search for herbs on sidewalks, follow the tracks of wild boar in the city's forests, or listen to the songs of nightingales in parks. As many explore the romance of urban nature and so-called wastelands, Debates about immigration and unemployment have stressed the existence of so-called troubled neighborhoods and a clash of cultures in the city's body. When Berlin plunged into a fiscal crisis after an initial post-unification euphoria and construction boom after the late 1990s, this coincided with deindustrialization as well as wide-ranging changes in labor market policies and welfare reform a few years later. Unemployment rates and poverty rose among many Berliners, and the city's immigrant communities, many employed in the manufacturing sector, were especially affected by this. Yet public discourse and policy located the source of these emergent inequalities in migrants themselves, and especially in a presumed lack of economic productivity that is supposed to leave traces of dereliction in the urban landscape. As for example, was the case and argued in Berlin's former finance senator Thilo Sarrazins controversial book, Deutschland schafft sich selbst ab, Germany abolishes itself. Terms such as parallel worlds and social hotspots have since stressed a sense of disconnection and invoke images of a lurking danger. The danger of fire breaking loose, the threat of wilderness imposing itself on the civilized city. Since the fall of 2015, as local bureaucracies scrambled to accommodate asylum seekers in the face of Europe's so-called refugee crisis, public discourse initially may have seemed to shift toward a welcoming tone vis-a-vis refugees from the Middle East and Africa. Yet upon a closer look at local media coverage, natural metaphors of so-called waves, rivers, tides, and tsunamis of people that put a strain on Europe and the nation's resources, not unlike natural disasters, abound. Debates about distribution and management of asylum seekers' arrivals once again invoke metaphors of chaos and so-called hotspots, both at Europe's borders and within. Current reformations of asylum law, enabling more efficient and fast deportations of those who are considered to be undeserving of asylum, precisely aim at domesticating this seemingly natural force at Europe's gate. As anthropologist Hassan Haj has recently pointed out, images of ruins, unruly nature, and urban plight in the global north, as well as the widespread sense of embattlement and porosity of national borders in the context of Europe's so-called migration crisis, express fantasies of colonial reversal at a time when various projects of governability of our global post-colonial or neo-colonial order, such as the nation's efforts to shore up borders and domesticate its others, as well as capitalism's extraction of natural resources, are coming undone. In a political climate of austerity in which the unemployed become superfluous and migrants and refugees confront constant suspicion of being unwilling to integrate, the question of how migrants inhabit nature in the city thus becomes a key site of articulating their status as strangers, irrespective of actual citizenship and thus in their racialization. For example, in recent years, local and national media have painted a gloomy picture of what is framed as the capital's underclass problem, depicting scenes of unemployed so-called wild barbecuers, a favorite pastime among many Turkish Berliners, seen as polluting the city's green lungs with smoke and garbage in the city's parks. As they enjoy the afternoon sun each weekend, many Turkish migrants are portrayed as reveling and roasting chicken wings, meatballs, and thighs of lambs, or even worse, entire animals. Both the bodies of migrants and their environments, as well as the smoke, meat, and litter they produce, figure as matter out of place in these scenarios. And migrants become almost animal-like, in need of containment in the designated barbecue areas, which is in fact what the city created. These tropes of disconnection and so-called urban wilderness also inform public policies, for example, in the form of EU-based integration projects that aim at fighting racial segregation, poverty, and so-called urban decay, or in changes to asylum law. As anthropologist Paul Silverstein has pointed out, for France, plans to reintegrate Europe's so-called hotspots, such as the banlieues in Paris, have been likened to the Marshall Plan for rebuilding war-struck Europe, drawing parallels between the ruins of war and the racialized urban peripheries of Europe today. In this climate of intense debate about nature and migration, for many, the city's green spaces, and especially its gardens, have once again provided spaces of hope for escaping social divisions. Many so-called multicultural gardens have proliferated across Berlin and other German cities in the past 2 decades. Cultivating plants, urban residents hope to overcome cultural barriers and parallel worlds, so-called parallel worlds. At the same time, gardening is seen as an opportunity for integrating migrants into society. Engaging with plants, people can identify with their surroundings and let integration grow. Whereas after the war, rubble plants formed an ambivalent urban ecology among projects of nation making, in the gardens of today's Berlin, the cultivation of plants once again serves as the basis for dreams of overcoming divisions. The question remains whether or not, unlike after the war, contemporary efforts of rehabilitating urban ecologies will be yet another version of reconstructing the nation through nature and a form of greening that glosses over past and present racisms, or whether their endeavor, Rose Bird's words, a step towards forging alliances that are in tune with the histories of violence embedded in urban landscapes and actually seek to do restorative work. Exploring this question, the idea of the ruderal can serve as a guide to shift attention to an ecology of nationhood, and thus to ask how the nation is naturalized and how specific bodies, those of people, plants, animals, and landscapes, are situated outside the national body. But attention to the ruderal also goes a step further, and nature is more than a metaphor here. Far from homogeneous, ruderal ecologies thrive in in-between spaces. They grow in the rubble created by war and exclusion. They emerge rather by chance, and they entail illegal border crossings, often unnoticed in the big histories of a city that tend to focus on buildings and people. A mode of attention that takes ruderal landscapes as a point of departure, thus seeks out ways of being alive that challenge neat distinctions between culture and nature and show that neither the mono-naturalism or multiculturalism so persistent in thinking about urban environments are perhaps poor tools to think with. Instead, rural worlds direct attention to the unexpected life that emerges in the cracks of and alongside inhospitable environments. As Austrian artist Louis Weinberger has pointed out, rurals require a form of precise inattention. If you're lucky, you catch a quick glance of them out of the corner of your eye on your way to somewhere else. Such a peripheral perspective then draws an understanding of ecology not as a naturalization of politics, but rather to invoke Latour as the recognition of the complexity of what it means for an entity, human or non-human, to have a voice, to be counted, to be connected with others. Hence, it opens up the view to relations and forms of embodiments that go beyond a city's anthropogenic landscapes. With this in mind, let me turn to Berlin's gardens. Beyond the hedges of publicized nature spaces, other less visible people-plant encounters exist. Their presence begs the question of what kind of more than human relations are desired and which ones exceed the kinds of urban nature that planners and migration policies have carved out. The Hasenheide Park in Neukölln covers 50 hectares of meadows dotted with oak and beech trees, elderberry shrubs, a rhododendron grove, and a small pond. The traces of urbanization and nationalism pervade the park's landscape, pointing to its transformation from a royal hunting ground, hence the name, to a public gymnastic sites and military drill ground in the early 20th century. After World War II, a 70-meter tall rubble hill containing the bombed city's debris was constructed at the park's edges. A popular hangout, the park has been the site of ongoing controversies around crime and drug dealers. Portrayed as so-called dangerous place in national and local media, images of escalating battles between Arab and African drug dealers who are often also refugees abound. At the same time, so-called wild barbecuing, especially popular among Turkish immigrants, is outlawed in the park. Right among the media flurry, as well as an adjacent meadow of German nudists, there has been a small corner of the park hidden in between bushes, invisible to local authorities. Cultivated by a group of friends and previous co-workers, the secret garden features fruit trees, sunflower, tomatoes, strawberries, cucumbers, mint peppers, and a few nettles in between. I'm showing a picture here of the garden during a very dry summer. I'm gonna comment on that in a little bit. Hidden in the shrub, there's also barbecue. The gardeners, all men in their late 60s and 70s, live nearby and come to the park every day, bringing food, plants, drinks, and card games. Like his fellow gardeners, Hakim migrated from rural Anatolia to Berlin in the late 1960s and 70s, when Turkey signed contracts with Germany to send migrant workers to German cities to continue to rebuild the country and boost the economy after the ruins of war. When Hakim arrived in Berlin in 1969, he was assigned 12 square meters of so-called living space in the city's migrant barracks. In the following decades, the West German government did not recognize Germany as a country of immigration. Hence, residence permits of the so-called guest workers were made conditional on work contracts as well as proof of adequate dwelling. Hakim had felt he had paid a big price, working himself broken like his colleagues and friends who now in their late 60s and 70s depended on walking aids or wheelchairs. Indeed, due to harsh and sometimes environmentally hazard working conditions, the rates for early retirement and disability among Turkish migrants or German Turks have been much higher than for Germans. Hakim had worked for an electronics company assembling adapters, but due to chronic neck injury from years of repetitive manual labor, he, like Osman Kalin at the beginning of this talk, had to retire early. His wife is dead, and instead of sitting at home, he went to the park to meet friends, like Kadir, who recently lost his eyesight during a work accident. According to Hakim, they began cultivating the garden because we were here all the time anyway. It must have been Errol. Maybe he was bored, but he just started moving the earth back and forth as we sat on the bench and chatted. In fact, Errol claimed that one day he dropped some sunflower seeds he was chewing on and they sprouted. In Turkish, they're called iEAR, a favorite social snack of which you can see traces across Berlin's streets and sidewalks. Whereas for Hakim, Berlin was a pile of concrete and rubble, the garden was the antithesis of that. Going there, he was able to breathe. His friends called the garden Maria Mama because someone had found a marble figure resembling Maria, the mother of Jesus, and placed it in the middle of the vegetable bed. Maria Mama was in constant flux. People kept adding tomato seedlings, brought seeds sent from Turkey, and ripped out dead plants. But most of all, the garden was a nursery for withering plants. Everyone brought plants they didn't need or were doing badly on apartment windowsills. Yet altogether, Maria Mama was a failure, at least according to its caretakers. One day, someone stole the apple tree, then the figure of Maria Mama disappeared. Now a pink stuffed bunny rabbit replaced it. Worse yet, the soil wasn't fertile enough, and there was a lack of water supply. Hakim had struck up a deal with the owner of the nearby kiosk to use the faucet, but it was a tedious business to carry the water all across the park. And yet he was hopeful. In fact, he dreamt that strawberries would cover the entire meadow of the park the next year. Not unlike Osman Kalin's Gecekondu garden at the beginning of my talk, Maria Mama constitutes a ruderal ecology. It not only filled the gap in between the city's landscape meadows, but also in Hakim's life. At first glance, Maria Mama may look like an object of nostalgia, an ephemeral project of elderly unemployed men who have become superfluous, if it is visible to anybody at all. And yet it sits squarely among contemporary multiculturalist efforts to integrate people via care of plants. Instead of waiting to be granted an assigned and often costly garden unit, the gardeners of Maria Mama took over space and created a sociality of neighbors and co-workers in the absence of work. Cobbled together of withering plants and thrown away seeds, Maria Mama is far from authentic. And in fact, when I asked the gardeners, they seemed rather indifferent to whether this was a Turkish or religious or Muslim garden. After all, once it was stolen, the figure of Maria Mama was quickly replaced by the pink rabbit. A project of recuperation of both plants and people, Maria Mama, like the Gecekondu garden, illustrates the frailties of projects that challenge urban nature defined by private property and urban planners, projects in which plants inspire people to forge new socialities. And although it may have been a failure the year I visited, its seeds are lying in the ground for remaking alternative ecologies of belonging out of Europe's material and social ruins of racial division, economic exploitation, and nationalism. In my talk, I have engaged a series of plant socialities and instances of remaking urban nature in Berlin. And the encounter between media, scientists, and rubble plants, as well as Turkish Berliners and their gardens, the lens of the ruderal guides me to look for the city's unintended ecologies, as these are produced in the context of nation-making, war, xenophobia, migration, and contemporary economic policies. Thus, I have followed the traces of an ecology of the nation and its ruination. To invoke Frantz Fanon, racial formations, after all, sow seeds of ruination that become embodied in people's bodies, livelihoods, landscapes, sensibilities, and things. Yet following these stories about rubble and gardens also means looking at the ways in which ruins have perhaps become our very gardens, thus to ask how people forge livelihoods in precarious environments. Finally, as I hope I've shown, the history of the post-war rubble plants highlights the open-ended and layered histories of the urban landscape. Ruderal ecologies grow from seeds carried on the boots of migrants and refugees and the city's infrastructure. And they may remain dormant potentials and unrealized futures that lie in the city's fabric. It remains an open-ended question whether they will enable flourishing or destruction. In an effort to do justice to these historical layerings and uncertain urban futures, I have deliberately put together disparate stories in the talk, but also do so in the book, such as West Berlin botanists researching rubble plants or Turkish migrants who plant gardens at the site of parks or in between walls, or barbecue smoke that interferes in debates about so-called urban wilderness and about who counts as Europe's appropriate urban citizen. Such a practice of shifting frameworks might push beyond a focus on singular and homogeneous entities of particular ethnic communities, scientific expertise, formal economies, institutions, or even what one may want to call the Anthropocene. In times of proliferating nationalisms, racial injustice, displacement, and the loss of hospitable environments, rather than simply integrate a focus on materiality or the non-human into urban analysis, I think there's an urgent need for practices that reach across scales and forge connections, a need to tell stories that do not eclipse the violence and social injustice embedded in urban landscapes. I thus argue that if we want to imagine a future of social, economic, and environmental justice in cities, or what Abdul Malik Simon has called a city yet to come, we have to attend to the ways in which unlikely neighbors inhabit and traverse the domesticated and ruined landscapes that make up our cities today. Okay, so I'm gonna stop sharing my screen now. That's the end of my talk.
Thank you so much, Bettina. Oh, that was incredible. That was really beautiful. Thank you. No, it's good. We have a few more minutes, and then we'll take a break until we go to the next project, the next presentation. You know, I use the article that was the kind of the precursor for the book with some of my classes, and the book just seems like you've added more and more stories in here, and it's really rich. And I think also back to Deborah Bird Rose and this way that the research you're doing and like someone like Deborah Bird Rose was doing has this overlap and this entanglement between the human and more than human entities and space and capitalism, kind of all looking at all of this at once. And I'm just curious, like, because I know I too share your sense that this is an urgent need to really focus on these kinds of strategies. And I'm curious how you were initially drawn to these kinds of pieces to put this very complex story together, because it's you know, very dense, but also I think it's the kind of lens that we need to look at and look through to move forward, as you've said. Mm. So do you have any backstory of just like, how did you get there? You know, it's sort of a simplified version of my question.
Yeah, thanks so much. That's a really great question. And I discussed it with Sina the other day when she was interviewing me, and I ended up talking for like 10 minutes. And so I don't want
but you have 3, yeah.
I just wanted to say, well, I started out, when I started out you know, the research for that kind of became the book, I had just finished a book about anti-racism and feminism in Europe and Germany, and I was involved in anti-racist networks and refugee advocacy groups and refugee rights alliances in Europe in the early 2000s. And so as part of that, I actually kind of wanted to continue working on, you know, thinking about forms of activism and anti-racist activism in Europe at the time. And so I spent a lot of time in the peripheries actually of Berlin, in the forest spaces, in the former socialist countryside, where a lot of refugee camps were located at the time. And there's a long history to why that happened, but I found myself, you know, spending a lot of time in these forest spaces and talking to a lot of people from East Africa and from Kenya who found themselves living in kind of the ruined barracks of former East German socialist military barracks, and living in forest spaces and kind of isolated at the periphery of Berlin. And so people spoke a lot to me about their experiences of racism and a sense of isolation. There was also a restriction of mobility for them as part of the asylum law at the time. And so I was struck how the landscape and the forests really kind of featured centrally in people's experiences of their everyday life, of everyday racism, and what they called the German bush. These were people mainly from urban Kenya I was talking to. And so I became really interested in people's relationship to land and to the environments they inhabit, and how the land becomes part of these experiences of everyday racism. And so I started paying attention to it, and all these other things popped up in the city, and there was kind of a resurgence of like celebrations of urban ecology and urban nature in Berlin at the time as well, while all these debates around migration and racism were happening at the same time. And so I felt it was important to bring these kind of separate, often treated as separate, but very much entangled debates and reconfigurations of the urban space and also its peripheries into conversation with one another. And so I kept running around from one place to another in Berlin, and kind of looking at these different communities that were affected by histories of displacement, of racism in very different ways. And so it became kind of a very eclectic project of thinking across different communities and their relationships to the land, both in the city and also its peripheries in the countryside.
Thank you. That was really great answer. I really appreciate it. Su Ming, I see your question in the chat, but we're going to have to hold it till the discussion, because I'm afraid we're going to have to take a break now and then come to the next presenter. So I will take note of it, and if you're not there, I will ask it for you. But and thank you for that question. And Bettina, just big shout out to you, and everyone, please, join me in thanking Bettina for this amazing talk about this new book, Ruderal City. Thank you for your time.